Weighing in smaller than some consoles, MSI's new Trident enters our bench for the first product review of the week. The Trident is a small form factor gaming PC that ships in 4 different SKUs, one of which is bare bones, and they range from $600 to $1,100. Our review looks at thermals, power, noise, and gaming performance of the $1,100 unit. Before getting to that, this content is brought to you by AMD and their RX 470 GPUs, which we've generally found to be the best price to performance for their class of video card, now at the sub $200 price point. You can find a link in the description below for more information on those. MSI's Trident claims to be the smallest VR-ready PC currently available. It stands on this stand, so there's obviously 2 modes of presenting it. One is flat, kind of like the average Lenovo Office PC, just like that, or in the stand, and it is sort of chiseled out at the bottom, so you can't just stand it up without the stand, or it'll be bad. So that is the Trident. It's about the size of a DVR. The dimensions are 346 by 72 by 232 millimeters. We'll put the inches equivalent somewhere on the screen if you prefer that system. And the stand makes it a little bit awkward where it's not as comfortable for me to have it this way. If you've got pets or maybe you have other small creatures that might knock things over, it's not the most stable setup in the world because there's no clamping system on the bottom to hold it in place. But it's basically meant to be used in an HTPC environment, so you put it like that or you put it flat and you use it with your TV is kind of the idea. Looking at the ventilation of the Trident first, we've got a pretty straightforward layout. The right side panel has a large mesh intake that covers the video card fan, and that video card is a GTX 1063GB, an MSI model of course, and uses an axial cooler. The CPU uses a small form factor blower fan, and that exhausts hot air out the back of the case, which also helps take care of some of the warmed GPU air. Air exits the back of the case through the GPU expansion slot and the CPU blower fan, and that's supported further by some ventilation on the opposing side panel of the enclosure. Our unit uses an i7-6700, 8GB of DDR4 memory, a GTX 1063GB card, and hosts 2 storage solutions, a 128GB SSD and a 1TB hard drive of mass storage. Windows 10 is pre-installed alongside a bunch of bloatware that we instantly removed. And this isn't the first time we've had to rail against MSI's use and reliance on bloatware either. Last time it was with one of the laptops, the GE62VR, where in testing we showed a performance degradation of 10 to 20% depending on which game and which bloatware was installed. So it's not great for performance. You should probably get rid of it immediately if you are going to buy one of these things. And thankfully it's easy to remove just through sort of control panel normal functions. But hopefully MSI gets the hint eventually and does kind of move away from Norton and all the various control panels and things like that. Regardless, that's what we've got for specs. The biggest marketing point here is the unit's portability and sort of DVR form factor, allowing for out-of-mind deployment in a living room for HTPC use or enabling LAN gaming portability. The unit we're running, this one, is the $1,100 unit. If you go look at systems priced in this range, even if it's from an SI versus a DIY approach, you end up with something like an iBuyPower or CyberPower machine or whatever that's obviously much larger than this, but probably about the same price, and would have a 1070 and maybe a 6700K. And if you go the DIY route, of course, that's also possible. So the price on this at $1,100 with a 1063GB card is entirely because of the form factor. You are paying for the fact that this is small. It does not have a power supply inside of it, which allows it to be this small, and you basically plug in an AC drop to the wall just like you would with the laptop, because it's always going to be less than 300 watts power draw, and we'll test that in a moment. So you're paying for the form factor. As always, our testing methodology and full written review are located in the link in the description below. If you're curious about how we tested anything, what drivers were used, or software and methods used, then check that article. Starting with thermals. Thermals are the most interesting point for this system, and using our thermal testing methodology with calibrated K-type thermocouples for ambient and internal diodes for the silicon, we can determine temperatures as a delta T over ambient value, and then you just add in your own ambient temperature for a rough approximation. Our thermal testing for systems is a little ridiculously load intensive, but the idea is to generate maximum heat and see how the enclosure copes with a worst case scenario. With Prime 95 large FFTs and Furmark blasting the components simultaneously, the CPU is hitting a delta T of about 66.5 Celsius, or about 90 C if you add ambient back in. Idle temperature is about 12.6. The GPU, meanwhile, operates at a completely reasonable 49.4 Celsius delta T, or about 70 to 73 if your ambient is in the 20s. and the hard drive is getting a little warm at 32.5 Celsius delta T, but remains acceptable overall. As this scenario is taxing both primary components at 100% load, we're dumping heat into the case that will then be recirculated by the CPU's blower fan. That's creating this higher CPU temperature, and under normal gaming workloads, the CPU remains closer to about 84 Celsius, still warm, but not as bad, and intense workloads push it pretty close to the limit. Granted, 90C isn't really anywhere as bad as what we saw with Origin's SFF Chronos PC a few months back, which was throttling before hitting TJ Max. Considering the tightness of the enclosure, it's not the world's worst small form factor performer when it comes to thermals, but it's not great either. MSI could certainly improve on the thermals by opting for a more aggressive fan profile, particularly with the CPU, even the GPU for that matter, but mostly the CPU. And unfortunately, most of that intake is coming from the wider GPU mesh right here, so all your air is being intercepted at this point and kind of relying on the GPU to bring it into the system and disperse it. And that grill, just sort of for the record here, this one doesn't have a separate mesh or dust filter to deal with dust. In an HPC environment, that's obviously a concern, especially with a small form factor system, but we'll talk about that more in a moment. Thermal discussion is always best accompanied by power discussion, measuring total system power draw from the wall connected via the Trident's AC adapter. We're seeing a power load of approximately 235 watts when the system is under complete maxed out load. Idle sits in the range of 47 watts to 51 watts, and that's not bad. Leaving this thing sitting on, for example, without any sleep states, you wouldn't draw much more power than a laptop. Load power consumption and heat generation shouldn't generally be high enough to heat up the living room, leaving noise to be the next obvious question. From desktop and with no software running, the Trident's fans generate a noise output of approximately 31.2 dBA after calculating out the noise level of the room. That's about the noise of most laptops when idle, assuming fan uptime. With the CPU and GPU fans pushing to higher RPMs when both are under 100% load, our noise increases to 38.6 decibels, and that's borderline acceptable for most living room gaming setups. In my opinion, if you've got the TV next to this thing, the Trident, and the couch is about 10 feet away, then you're probably okay. But that's really a subjective point, so up to you to decide that. Overall, the noise levels aren't really that bad. 38.6 dBA for a completely maxed system is pretty damn good overall for a small box, considering most gaming workloads will generate a dBA output between our idle and load metrics anyway. Time to talk gaming performance. This section is a little less interesting since the performance will largely be identical to what you'd already expect from a 1060 and an i7-6700. Starting with 1080p benchmarks and ultra settings across the board, our lowest FPS throughput is with Battlefield 1 at ultra and a 96-degree horizontal FOV. The game averages 59 FPS with lows around 37 and 30 FPS, which is reasonable, but does begin to choke a bit in some more intense battles, so you'd want a slight settings reduction one step down to compensate for that. GTA 5 is the next on the chart, outputting an average of 79 with lows 42 and 35 with the 0.1% low metrics. Doom is next, and that performs adequately as well, despite struggling at times with 0.1% low values, and our average here is 67 and 1% lows are 39. Dirt Rally, which we figure is more of a couch-friendly game, averages a frame rate of about 82 FPS with its options nearly maxed and sustains high-low values through the benchmark course, and Dota 2, unsurprisingly, has no problems at all. Moving on to 1440p, Battlefield 1 starts to struggle a bit, but GTA 5 remains relatively playable aside from a few hiccups. Doom sits at 50 FPS now, and Dirt Rally drops to 61 average. And just for one 4K test, since some folks probably will be connecting this to 4K TVs, we did see Dirt Rally at Ultra at around 33 FPS, average for 4K. So it's really not a box you'd want for 4K gaming, high settings or otherwise. As far as VR gaming, running a 3GB GTX 1060 is sort of pushing the limits for what an HTC Vive or an Oculus Rift would demand. Raw data exhibits a few app and warp misses with low to medium settings, but anything higher than that is just venturing into unpleasant territory. It isn't really something you should consider. Technically, MSI is correct in that this is a VR-ready system and that you can play VR games, and that's a big marketing point. It's kind of driving me crazy how many components are going with VR-ready as their main selling point right now. But just sort of looking at that one aspect, they are technically correct. It's just that you would really be playing at kind of low settings, maybe a mix of medium and low, with the more intensive games like Raw Data, which we've tested, and Everest, definitely trending towards low to medium on that one. So don't expect great things out of this video card with VR, but it'll work. Now, value for this unit basically hinges entirely on its small form factor. So again, $1,000, $1,100 would get you probably a GTX 1070 and an equivalent or slightly better i7 in a larger form factor machine. So this markup is because it's small, and it's the same idea as with laptops where you're paying more because it's basically portable. This is not quite as portable as a laptop, of course, but you could throw it in a bag and it would fit fine. It's also small enough to operate as a home theater PC while remaining pretty quiet and hidden to stay out of sight in the living room. The chassis is well constructed overall and survives our torture testing for thermals, though the CPU starts getting hot when both components are under high load. It's surviving though and passing minimum requirements, I guess, for thermals in an SFF build. There's no throttling going on, which would further be aided by slightly increased fan speeds and some manual effort since MSI has not that aggressive fan profile. Gaming performance is what you'd expect. It's a GTX 1063GB with an i7-6700, both well-charted components. That leaves us primarily to look at overall value of the box. At $1,100, there's not much that competes for SFF machines. You could take the DIY route and build something like a Silverstone Raven RV-Z02 for a bit cheaper, but it would also be a bit larger. And if DIY is completely unappealing to you, then the options are basically Origin's Chronos, which we found to be pretty questionable value given the price, or the Alienware Alpha, which is not really a direct competitor. A bare bones variant of the Trident can be had for $600. It's basically a half-baked bare bones version. If you want to take a semi-DIY approach to a machine this size, you get the power adapter, obviously, the enclosure, and then some basics like the board and a GPU, I believe. But you are left to your own devices for storage and for memory. You could probably cut down cost a little bit by going that route, but it's still getting pretty close to the $1,100 price point that we saw for this thing. Now, there's also another SKU. There's an i5 SKU for $950, which really shouldn't exist at that price point. I think this should come down a little bit from the $1,100 price point. But the $950 for an i5, the value does kind of get a bit muddied. The Trident has a few places it could improve. For one, a detachable dust filter on the primary intake would allow for way easier cleaning given the oft dusty nature of an HTPC environment, and that'd cost next to nothing. I'll also nitpick that MSI is still sticking the warranty void if removed stickers on their panel screws, which is sort of a stupid thing to do on a box like this. It's not a laptop. It's not tricky to get apart and put back together. It's something like 5 screws. And you have to dig through that warranty sticker just to clean the dust out of the GPU intake. So this is one of those things where either you include a dust filter or you don't and you let people open it. And I'm not saying that this machine is worse than any other machine with regard to dust, but in the real world, dust is a problem, and it's a much bigger problem when the box is small and when you have low thermal headroom like this one does before hitting throttle points. Thermals are acceptable, like I said, they get by. But when you've got only 10 or so degrees to move, when you're under a maximum load scenario, there's not a lot of room. So to MSI, just sort of the quick suggestions for this thing for improving it, I would suggest 1, a detachable cheap dust filter right there. 2, get rid of the warranty void if removed threats on this particular box. It's just, on a laptop, I can kind of understand it. I know it's questionable whether those are really enforceable, but on a small unit like this, where it's basically a desktop, and it's gonna die, if that's backwards, if they don't open it up and clean it out, I'd probably say get rid of those stickers. Other than that, you can add probably some sort of latching mechanism down here to keep it better mounted in place, because again, not super stable. It's fine, I guess, but if you've got people moving around or pets, I would feel very unhappy with it that way. Probably leave it like that. Next suggestion, VR branding. As always, have to be careful about it. So yes, it can play VR games. No user should reasonably expect more than low, medium, low settings. And then finally, the bloatware. Please, MSI, get rid of it. It's killing the performance. The laptops were the best example because they were worse than this thing. They had a lot more utilities installed, and performance hit was pretty nasty. So this is an area where it's really best, I think, to let the user decide what's installed, and the bare bones route would let you do that. So they do have a solution if you don't want to go through the uninstall process, which you should do. But still, it's I don't know that the B2B partnerships with people like Norton and all the other software utilities, all the control panels, all the audio panels, all this stuff, I don't know that it's worth it because it makes performance out of box look worse than competitors, and that's not what you ever want. So those would be the main suggestions and the nitpicks for this machine. All of this said, with the grievances aside, the chassis is well constructed. I like the form factor. Despite this being sort of not the most stable base, it is artistically interesting because of the way they've angled it, although obviously you've really only got one other option, which is flat like that. So it's well built. For $1,000, it would be a much easier buy. At 1100, it is kind of makes me feel a little weird about it. But $1,000, you're in better shape. It's just, again, you're sacrificing for size, basically. So that is the Trident. Considering the density of the unit, the thermals under gaming loads are fine. Noise is fine. FPS is fine. But that's really all it is. It's just kind of everything is acceptable or fine. There's nothing revolutionary. A price reduction would help a bit in that regard. So as always, Patreon link in the post roll video to help us out directly. Links in the description below for more information, the full review. Leave a comment, because if you don't, YouTube will punish our video. Apparently that's what's going on this week. I'll see you all next time.